Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we are a week away from a pretty big day here in the United States. It's election day, and we're going to be not only electing a new president, one way or another, we're going to have a new president. We're either going to have the first female president, or we're going to have the second time in history that there has been non-consecutive terms for a president. So either way, it's going to be major history. But we're also electing a third of our Senate and all of our House of Representatives. So major things are happening here in the United States, and really it's too close to call. Nobody knows what's going to happen with any of those three things: the Senate, the House, the White House. Nobody knows. It's going to be close. It's going to be interesting. And that brought me to this video from our friend Matt at Useful Charts. You've heard me talk some about the idea of political party systems in the United States, that every couple of generations we undergo a pretty radical shift in the nature of our political parties and what they stand for and what the major issues are, even sometimes who the major opposing parties are. And I believe fully that we are in the midst of one of those political party shifts right now. And that 10, 20 years from now, the two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are going to look very, very different than they did a decade ago. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. I think we're still in the middle of it. So with that in mind, Matt has this chart that he has made that I think is fantastic. That's a timeline of U.S. political parties. I don't know if he made this himself or if this is one that was done by someone else. I guess we're going to find out as we dive into this, because it definitely looks very different than his usual style. But I think it's a fantastic topic for us to discuss. How have the parties changed over time? Because there's been, depending on who you listen to, either 5 or 6 different political party systems in the United States, the major shifts that we have undergone. So I'll put the link down in the description to the original content so you can check it out without my commentary. Just a couple of things to let you know that are coming up from me. On Election Day, which is next Tuesday, I am going to be appearing on with Mr. Terry. He's doing a live stream that night covering the election. So I'll be joining him for at least part of that, just to talk about what's going on. And also, sometime later on this week, I'm going to be doing my own live stream where I'm going to be predicting what I think is going to happen. Not only with each state, who's going to win each state for the White House, how the electoral votes I think are going to shake out, but also the House and the Senate, what I think is going to happen with those. So be watching for that live stream. And I've also been taking questions from our patrons, and I'm going to be doing a private live stream for patrons and members, where I'll be answering all of those questions, plus any questions we get. That'll be coming in the next couple of days, so be watching for that. As always, make sure your notifications are turned on so you never miss another video. Let's dive into this one.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Every now and then on this channel, I like to take a look at a really old chart rather than one that was designed on a computer.
I thought that this looked really familiar to me, that I'd seen it before. So I was right in saying this wasn't one of his charts, but that's cool. I love it.
Personally, I find these vintage charts beautiful, and there's often things that we can still learn from them, even if they are out of date. So far, we've looked at Adam's synchronological chart of history, the bird's eye view of the life of Christ, and the histomap of religion by John B. Sparks. Well, today, since the U.S. election is coming up, I thought I'd take a look at this timeline of U.S. political parties. It was published back in 1880 as a fold-out chart in this book called Conspectus of the History of Political Parties and the Federal Government.
And that might sound like a really dry topic to cover, but as recently as the early 20th century, the teaching of the political party systems was actually a part of curriculum in a lot of public schools. This was something that people used to actually study and know a lot about, and I feel like we've gotten away from that. We've really gotten away from civics in general. I don't want to say completely, but I think now we study government and how the government functions, but not really what our role is and all that beyond just voting.
By Walter R. Houghton of Indiana University. Of course, nowadays, U.S. politics is dominated by the Republicans and the Democrats. But this was not always the case. Prior to the emergence of the current parties, there were actually several other older parties, such as the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, and the Whigs. By taking a look at these older parties, it will help us better understand the origins of the two current parties.
Yeah.
So let's start here with the period before the start of George Washington's presidency. Now, since the American colonies were originally British, they initially had the same two political parties that Great Britain had, which were the Tories and the Whigs. Basically, the Tories were those who strongly supported the monarchy, whereas the Whigs were those who wanted to give local representatives more power.
Yeah, and why then, when you look at the American Revolution, and remember that in the American Revolution, that's really a civil war, because within the colonies, you had people who were loyal to the crown. They were called loyalists and often called Tories because they were the crown's side. They were the people who wanted to remain loyal. They didn't really call the other side Whigs. They called them patriots, but it was really patriots and Tories. If you were a Tory, you were somebody who wanted to remain part of the British Empire. And in fact, down in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, where a lot of the loyalists got hanged, including one of my ancestors, they called it the Tory Oak because that's where they hanged the Tories.
During the American Revolution, it was obviously the Whigs, also known as patriots, who dominated, with the loyalist Tories disappearing entirely in 1783, which...
So I love that he's pointing that out, and I love what this map does here, is that it shows that, the Tories didn't cease to exist. They just ceased to exist as a major political force in the United States because the people who ended up in power were all on the other side. And then what happens, and this happens multiple times, is that once you only have really one dominant party and they've won out and the other parties really cease to exist, like the Federalists end up doing, then what happens is within that party, there become fractures. And this is just part of human nature. When we are we're fighting against a common enemy, we're on the same side. Once we've eliminated that enemy, now the cracks form between us. We were all on the same side. The Whigs were in wanting independence, but now we've got independence. Now we focus on our differences with each other.
Which is when the British finally recognized U.S. independence. Thus, because the U.S. had done away with monarchy altogether, they were left with just a single party, the Whigs. But this situation did not last for long. Although the U.S. was now a republic, there were differences in opinion over how strong the new federal government should be. Those who wanted a strong federal government, with things like a central bank and a standing army, became known as Federalists, whereas those who wanted more state sovereignty were called Anti-Federalists.
And this is where then the development of a two-party system happens, where you have one party and another, and other parties crop up here and there, sometimes from both parties, like disaffected people in both form another one, but it never lasts that way. It always defaults back to two. It always defaults back to people who find themselves on opposing sides of major issues. And that, I think, has determined a lot of the party systems, is fundamental differences of opinion on key issues. So then as the key issues change, the party systems change, and they reinvent themselves around those issues. This started as a situation where you had the people in power, the government party, and the opposition. The government party was the Federalists. It kind of coalesced around, George Washington hated the idea of political parties, so he was kind of above party. And so it was his right-hand man, Alexander Hamilton, around whom the Federalist Party coalesces. And then it was also within Washington's government, it was his Secretary of State, a guy like Thomas Jefferson, and then you have James Madison, who is in Congress at that point. They kind of become the de facto leaders of the opposition, the Democratic Republicans. And eventually the Federalists die out after Hamilton dies, and after there's kind of a civil war between the Hamiltonians and the people who support John Adams, to where then you just have the Democratic Republicans.
The Federalists were largely responsible for creating the U.S. Constitution, whereas the Anti-Federalists, who were unhappy with it, were responsible for getting the first 10 amendments added.
And it's fascinating because James Madison, who's one of the anti-federalists, Democratic Republicans, as they end up being called, is considered the father of the Constitution. He understood that we needed something stronger than the Articles of Confederation. What he and guys like Hamilton disagreed on was what that new system was going to look like. They didn't agree on how strong the new federal government would be. They just all agreed it needed to be stronger than what we had.
Collectively are known as the U.S. Bill of Rights. Now, technically, the first president, George Washington, did not belong to either faction. However, most of the members of his administration were definitely Federalists. In particular, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who is considered to be the official founder of the Federalist Party, shown in pink. In contrast, Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, ended up leading an opposing faction.
I guess I should have just shut up and let him talk for a few more seconds.
This eventually became what we now call the Democratic Republican Party, shown in green. Although at the time they were simply called the Republicans.
Yeah.
The reason why...
And that can make it confusing because out of the Democratic Republican Party, you're going to have the modern Democratic Party, which is kind of come about around the time of Andrew Jackson. But they were called Republicans, even though they are the precursor to the Democrats.
Historians now call them Democratic Republicans, is to distinguish them from the current Republicans, who are not directly related. Okay, so from 1789 to 1824, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were the two main parties. Generally speaking, the Federalists appealed more to the upper classes, who lived in cities and owned businesses, whereas the Democratic Republicans appealed more to farmers and everyday folk.
Honestly, John Adams was really the only Federalist president. That's kind of it, because then you get Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These guys are all Democratic Republicans.
Notice that around the year 1800, the pink line and the green line switch places. That's because on this chart, the party that controlled the presidency is always shown on top.
Oh, okay.
So basically,
I wondered why it was snaking like that. That's cool.
Federalists were dominant during Washington's tenure and then officially held the presidency under John Adams, who had been Washington's vice president. But then in 1801, the Democratic Republicans took over, with Thomas Jefferson being elected president. Jefferson is credited with strengthening America's democracy by getting more people to vote and for transferring power away from the aristocracy and towards the general public.
And it is interesting because Jefferson represents the Democratic Republicans they're Republican in nature. They prefer a weak federal government in favor of a stronger local or state government. And yet some of the things he does during his presidency serve to radically strengthen the federal government. Even things like creating a West Point, which leads to a standing army, which was something he opposed. Doubling the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. But he was at heart definitely a state-first kind of guy. And you're going to see that come about later in the evolution of the Democratic Party under people like Andrew Jackson and after.
Although keep in mind that at this point, the general public was limited to white males only. Whereas the Federalists wanted the U.S. to be more like Britain, just without a king, the Democratic Republicans wanted the U.S. to be more like France, which had just experienced the French Revolution.
And that even then led to the competing loyalties as far as who we should be allied with. You know, many of the Democratic Republicans, guys like Jefferson, had very strong feelings toward France. And he was actually in France at the beginning stages of the Revolution. He helps the Marquis de Lafayette draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is a strong document in favor of the French Revolution. And Jefferson felt strongly about that, whereas Adams was very much more pro-British in his sentiments.
Which brings me to left-wing versus right-wing. Nowadays, these terms are pretty much synonymous with the words liberal and conservative. But originally, they actually had more to do with something else. They originated in France during the French Revolution, when supporters of the king would sit on his right side and the supporters of the revolution would sit on his left side. So at this point, because the US didn't have a king, they didn't really have a right-wing party and a left-wing party. However, over time, the term right-wing has instead come to represent any group that wants to conserve the older traditional ways of doing things, whereas the term left-wing has come to represent those who want to progress forward. Now,
and that's a great point because within these party systems, what that looks like changes. What's traditional may change, even if the parties don't, or if the parties change. For example, leading up to the American Civil War, the proponents of tradition and doing things a certain way, the conservatives, were very much more on the Democrat side, whereas today conservatives are much more on the Republican side. But throughout most of history, even within these parties, there were progressives and conservatives. Lincoln was a moderate Republican, but he dealt with what they called radical Republicans, which were the progressives. In his party, but there were also conservatives within his party because there were certain issues on which they all agreed. So, for example, the Republicans all agreed on being pro-union in the 1860s. So, from that standpoint, they were united by that major issue of pro-union. But they disagreed on things like the status of slavery, how quickly it should be abolished, and what to do with the newly freed men. Should they be given citizenship? Should they be given equality? On that, there were liberals, there were conservatives, and there were moderates. But on the big issue that united them, they were together.
Before we move on, I also want to point out this part of the chart down here, where you can see a bunch of little pink and green squares. This shows which party controlled Congress, with the top square representing the Senate and the bottom square representing the House.
There's so much detail on this chart. I kind of want one. I bet there's probably somewhere you can buy these.
So that's pretty cool. Moving along the main timeline, we see that Jefferson was followed by James Madison, who was president during the War of 1812. Following that war, the Federalist Party basically fizzled out, resulting in what's called the Era of Good Feeling.
Why is it good feeling? Because there were no political parties fighting with each other. Everybody was on the same side for a couple of elections.
In which the U.S. experienced a renewed sense of nationalism and unity. This period coincided with the presidency of James Monroe, and during his 8 years as president, it almost seemed as if party politics were going to become a thing of the past.
Yeah, and here's what you're going to notice. This is the last time for a long time, and I mean a really long time. I'm trying to think of when the next time this happened, that you have 3 presidents who all serve 2 full terms in office. 8 years for Jefferson, 8 years for Madison, 8 years for Monroe. And then you're going to get into some contentious elections like 24 and 28 between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and some others. Then you're going to get into that series of presidents who aren't very good and don't serve for very long.
But that, of course, was wishful thinking. Pretty soon, the Democratic-Republican Party started to fracture into a bunch of different factions.
And that's what we talked about earlier, is that as soon as you have unity, now it's infighting. Now it's focusing. Instead of focusing on what unified us, we focus on what could divide us. And once again, you default into 2 political parties. It didn't start out that way. You break into a bunch of parties, but eventually one of them rises to the top, in this case, the Whigs.
Setting the stage for a new set of parties. It started with the election of 1824, in which the only party, the Democratic Republicans, ran 4 different candidates for president. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, as well as the most electoral college votes, but not enough to win a majority. Therefore, the House of Representatives was tasked with holding a contingent election, which was then won by John Quincy Adams.
So how this works is when you have a situation where nobody gets a majority, and in the other cases where this happened, like in 1824, what you have is you have multiple people dividing the electoral votes, making it more likely nobody would get at least 50% plus 1, basically, of the electoral votes. in other cases, like 1876, what you have is a contentious situation where you're not sure which of the two candidates is going to get it. In that case, it goes to the House. And the way it works in the House is it's not just a straight vote where, for example, now we have 435 members of the House. There aren't 435 votes and whoever wins, wins. Each state gets one vote. That means all of, for example, the Ohio congressmen and women get together, in this case, just men, and they vote. And whoever gets more votes in that state, that's one vote. So, for example, if that happened in this election, Ohio is almost all Republicans in Congress. They would vote, and Ohio's one vote would go to Donald Trump in this election. New Jersey would get one vote. Delaware gets one vote. Virginia gets one vote. So no matter how big or small your state is, you get one vote. And that's how then you get John Quincy Adams winning, even though he didn't have the most popular votes and he didn't have the most electoral votes. He got the most out of the two of them when it went to the House.
The son of the second president, John Adams. At this point, what was technically one party started to split into two, with the Adams supporters on one side and the Jackson supporters on the other. Eventually,
again, it becomes a pro-government versus anti-current government, much like how the two parties formed during Washington's administration.
The Jackson supporters started their own new party called the Democratic Party, shown on this chart in yellow. Take note that this is the same Democratic Party that exists to this day. On the other hand, the Adams supporters became known as the National Republicans, shown on this chart in pink. They lost in 1828, which is when the Democrats elected their very first president, Andrew Jackson. 4 years later, Jackson won again, which led the National Republicans to fall apart.
And notice, and this is one of the things I love about this chart, you see these little things that offshoot, like where it says nullification, talking about the nullification crisis, anti-Mason coming in. Because what you have happen, and this is how you get party systems, is that, okay, now we've got the Democrats and we've got the National Republicans. Well, some of the Democrats are going to leave the Democrats over an issue like nullification. Some of them are going to come back to the Democrats, but some are going to leave and join with the National Republicans and the anti-Masons to form the Whigs. But then you're going to have more split-offs. And every time there's a new political issue that maybe didn't exist or wasn't a prominent concern that comes to the forefront, there's going to be a shuffling. There's going to be people who are going to defect from one to the other. So in 1980s, for example, we talk about the Reagan Republicans. These are people who had been, or the Reagan Democrats, I should say. These are people who were Democrats, but in that particular case, they found things about Reagan that they liked. Here in Ohio, we saw that recently. This is one of the reasons why I think we're in the middle of a political party shift, a party system shift, is that Ohio had been a real strong swing state. And where I live is one of the bluest counties in Ohio traditionally. For most of my life, you couldn't get elected in this county without a D next to your name. But then Donald Trump comes along, and suddenly a lot of people here who always voted Democrat voted for Donald Trump. And now I drive around what was 10 years ago one of the bluest counties in Ohio, and I see nothing but Trump signs. That's how things shift. And I don't know exactly what the particular issue is that shifted for them, but we see a moving of people from one party to another based on what's going on.
By this point, several smaller third parties had formed, namely the Anti-Masonic Party, which, as the name implies, was mostly focused on criticizing Freemasons, who they saw as elites who wielded too much power, as well as the Nullification Party, which wanted to give states the right to nullify federal laws. Basically, some of the nullifiers combined with the National Republicans as well as the Anti-Masons to form a new Whig party. Thus, for the next little while, America once again had two main parties.
And look how much it's back and forth, back and forth. This is what I mean. You go from a lot of stability and a lot of unity to chaos. And this chaos leads to the Civil War.
Democrats and the Whigs. You can see here from this very twisty portion that they switched back and forth quite a bit.
And there's so many things happening here. There's so much undergoing. We go from 1828 to 1868, this 40-year stretch where there's just so much shifting loyalties and shifting party systems, and then it eventually kind of settles after the Civil War.
In fact, this period marked the first time in U.S. history where there were two parties very equally matched. You can see also that this period was quite chaotic, with a bunch of new third parties being formed as well. One of these was the Liberty Party, shown in pink.
And this was really our best chance, I think, in American history to end up with a multi-party system that was functional. Unfortunately, because the dominant issues were state versus federal power and slavery and tariffs as well, but really especially those others. Because of those dominant issues, eventually everybody coalesced around one or the other. And we missed a chance to have multiple parties.
Which wanted the abolition of slavery. It eventually merged with a Democratic faction called the Barn Burners to form the Free Soil Party, shown in dark blue.
So there you have factions breaking off depending on the issue, and these are how you get these realignments.
The main goal of the Free Soil Party was to prevent the extension of slavery into America's newly acquired lands in the West. There was also the Native American Party, shown in purple, but don't be confused by the name. This was not a party made up of American Indians, but rather one made up of white Protestants who were very anti-immigration.
If you ever watch the movie Gangs of New York, the nativists, the people who are opposed to immigrants and to Catholics and to people of color, that's who you're talking about.
Later, they were simply called the American Party, but they were also known as the Know-Nothings because when outsiders asked about their movement, they would simply say, "I know nothing." But then in 1854, the issue of slavery came to a head with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
See how one single issue can completely reshape the political landscape. This issue cemented loyalties into two parties, and this is where you have the birth of the Republican Party.
Which basically meant that slavery could be extended to those areas. At this point, the entire political landscape reoriented itself around the issue. In the North, Democrats, who were anti-Nebraska, joined with the majority of Whigs, as well as the Free Soil Party, to form a brand new anti-slavery party called the Republican Party, shown in red. This Republican Party is the one that still exists to this day. At the same time in the South, all the pro-slavery Whigs moved to either the Democrats or the American Party.
Depending on what your issue was. What is your issue? You know, I give you a great example of this. A lot of people are single issue voters, and for them, that is the overarching thing that matters. And so your issue might be abortion, or it might be taxation, or it might be some other social issue. It might be foreign policy. And if, for example, the party that represents you on that issue were to say tomorrow we no longer support that issue, would that leave you feeling like you didn't have a home? Or let's say tomorrow, say you voted all your life as a Democrat, and tomorrow the Democrats said we no longer support that issue. We're taking the opposite stance. And the Republicans said, now we do support that issue. If that is the overarching issue for you, you could see a situation where that might leave you to say, you know what, I'm not a Democrat anymore. I'm going to start voting for the Republicans. And this is how party systems shift.
Thus, in 1856, there were three main candidates. However, the Democrats still won, electing James Buchanan, who today is considered to have been the worst president in U.S. history. But then, 4 years later, in 1860, came what would become the most consequential U.S. election of all time. This time, the Democrats split into two camps, with the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats each choosing their own candidate. In addition to this, the new Constitutional Union Party, mostly made up of former American Party members, also fielded a candidate. In the end, all of this vote splitting resulted in a victory for the anti-slavery Republicans, now led by Abraham Lincoln.
Now, I will say this about this party. I mean, you've got John C. Breckinridge, who is the sitting vice president, youngest vice president in American history. He's Buchanan's vice president. You've got Stephen Douglas, who is also from Illinois, like Abraham Lincoln. He's a Democrat. And then you have John Bell from the Constitutional Union Party. Now, a lot is made of the fact that, this is what led to Lincoln being able to win. But if you were to take all, and I know it's not this simple, if you were to take all of these votes and say give them to Stephen Douglas or to Breckinridge, all the votes that all three candidates got, Lincoln still narrowly wins that election. So it wasn't quite as simple as saying they divided the vote, that's why Lincoln won. But that doesn't take into consideration, had there been one candidate, would the votes have gone the same way that they did? So it is certainly more complicated.
Victory for the anti-slavery Republicans, now led by Abraham Lincoln. But of course, it also resulted in the U.S. Civil War, which is why you see the Confederates splitting off from the Democrats here. As you know, the North won that war, and the United States became united once again. From here to the end of this chart, the Republicans remained in power, although technically Johnson was a Democrat, even though he was elected alongside Lincoln as part of the National Union ticket. So for this last part of the chart, there is yet again two parties, this time the Republicans and the Democrats. If we zoom out, we can basically divide the first...
And let's not overlook some of the stuff that's going on here, and maybe he'll take a look at it. But remember, I said there are liberals and there are conservatives within the Republican Party. Well, in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln, now that slavery is no longer the dominant issue, and now you're moving on to other issues like money, and we're dealing with how do we deal with Reconstruction in the South, and how do we deal with the freedmen. Now, some of those liberals are going to split off to the Democratic Party, and that's how the Democrats are going to come back into being competitive again, because it's pretty dominated by the Republicans. You have Grant winning in 68 and 72. But then as you get into the mid-70s and into the 1880s, the Democrats once again are able to take Congress. You see that here in 76. They take back the House. And eventually in 1880, they're going to have the House and the Senate, even though the Republicans narrowly win the White House. And that's because some of these liberals then go to the Democrats over particular issues. And then you have some of the Democrats who jump up here and unite with some Republicans on issues like temperance and money and finance and business and all of that stuff are going to become then the dominant issues, and things like tariffs and the spoils system. So kind of government reform. These are going to become the dominant issues in the later part of the century.
First 100 years of U.S. history into three main parts. From 1792 to 1825, there was the first party system, consisting of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Then, from 1828 to 1854, there was the second party system, with the Democrats versus the Whigs. Finally, from 1854 through to the 1890s, there was a third party system, with the Democrats versus the Republicans.
And the existing systems now are still Democrats versus Republicans. It's just on what issues do they find themselves divided and how they are reforming. The Republican Party is fundamentally different, and the Democratic Party are fundamentally different on the issues by the time you get to the 1890s.
Now, before I tell you about the fourth, fifth, and sixth systems, which are not shown on this chart, there are a few more things on here that I'd like to point out. First, take note of this line here, which represents the first time that formerly enslaved Black Americans were able to vote.
In this case, men for voting.
Nowadays, most Black Americans tend to vote for the Democrats, but back then they mostly voted for Republicans, if they voted at all. Then there's this line here, labeled liberal, standing for liberal Republicans, who during the 1872 elections supported the Democratic candidate.
Greeley?
Also shown is the temperance movement, which drew from both Republicans and Democrats. It eventually led to the prohibition of alcohol, but That didn't actually happen nationwide until 1920.
And
Finally,
I love even just the little details, all the different issues that you're seeing here. Prison system of labor, making war debt, equitable railroad rates, one-term currency based on property, all this stuff like that.
The labor reform movement, which started to gain traction in the late 1800s. Now, as you can see, this chart ends around the year 1880, which is when it was first published. A later edition extended it to 1892, showing the first post-Civil War Democrat to be elected, Grover Cleveland. But after that, there were sadly no more updates. Thus, in order to bring things up to date and tell you what happened between 1892 and today, I'm going to have to use a more recent chart. There are several out there, such as this timeline, but the one that I like best is this chart, created by Kathleen Cowell. As you can see, it shows the first 3 party systems, which we've already covered, but then goes on to show the rest as well, starting with the 4th. The 4th party system was a lot like the 3rd, with the Republicans dominating in the North and the Democrats dominating in the South. But the main difference was the increasing focus on progressive issues by both parties. For example, this was the period when women fought for the right to vote, which they were granted nationally in 1920. All of this led up to the Great Realignment of 1932, which marked the transition to the 5th party system.
And this is right when people talk about party switch. It's a realignment of party systems, which happens over and over again and is happening again.
Originally, the Republican Party was the more progressive one, the one that pushed for big government projects, and the one that had its base in the North and in urban centers, whereas the Democratic Party was more conservative, wanted a smaller government, and was more popular in the South and in rural areas. However, starting with the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt, things basically switched and have remained switched to this day. Take note that during the 5th party system, the Democrats held power most of the time.
And you see again, you have liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans. It's only very recent that there's been a real polarization between the parties on the issue of liberal versus conservative. There have always existed coalitions and factions.
But during the 6th and current system, it's mostly been even. Now, some analysts argue that we are currently entering, or have already entered, a 7th party system.
100%.
Especially considering how much Trumpism has changed the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
But the jury's still out on that one.
I don't think it is. I think we're clearly undergoing. We just don't know what it's going to look like on the other side yet, but we're definitely undergoing a change into a 7th party system.
A lot will depend on how the current election pans
That's true.
out. Okay, so that was a look at the...
think about that for a second. If Donald Trump wins this election, I think that pretty much solidifies a transformation in one way. If he loses, it also kind of shows how there's a bit of a transformation. So either way, it's going to be interesting to see 10, 20 years from now when Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party is a thing of the past. Where we see, are the people who follow in his footsteps, like the J.D. Vances of the world, going to be the next leaders? Or is there going to be like a shift back to more traditional Republicanism? What's going to happen on the Democrat side? It's going to be interesting to see.
The timeline of U.S. political parties. I'll leave a link to all the charts I've shown in the description. And be sure to subscribe to the channel because I'm currently working on an update of my own timeline of U.S. history chart.
Oh, nice. That'll be cool. So that's interesting. So I hope you learned something from that. I'm definitely interested in getting that chart just for my own to kind of have maybe on display here somewhere because I just think it's really cool and it's a fascinating way to look and to understand what was going on in history. So what would you add to that? Let me know in the comment section below. Definitely check out Useful Charts. He's got a really cool way of presenting some amazing history, especially someone who loves family trees. He does a lot of family trees, but he does a lot of other stuff too. And he's got a degree in religion as well, so he does a lot of stuff where he looks at religion from, I think, a pretty objective viewpoint. So check that out. Thanks for watching.